So my name is Chen, and I have engaged intensively with rhythm analysis for the past 5-6 years. So I started doing rhythm analysis in my PhD, and then I moved on to publish a book called Practicing Rhythm Analysis Theories and Methodologies. But for today's talk, I will be mostly focusing on the relationship between rhythm analysis and what it offers for doing cultural historical work. The interest in discussing this today with you is not only because I've done sort of cultural historical work using rhythm analysis as a methodology. So I was looking at particularly at the kind of cultural conjunctural shift in the 1970s and 80s in this country through the lens of rhythm analysis. But also, I'm kind of the interest in this topic, I think, is really kind of also prompted by my experience of presenting at conferences and also at job interviews, where people ask me, "But you were not there. So, how could you do cultural historical work using rhythm analysis?" Which I think is a kind of a plausible sort of qualm that people have. If you were not there, how could you know about the kind of historical rhythms? How could you write about it? So this is kind of the kind of motivation behind my talk today. And I think, also, I think there are kind of other theoretical sort of developments or kind of theories which are kind of has an affinity with rhythm analysis, such as phenomenology, sort of theories of affect, structures of feeling, all these kind of resurgent interest in these kind of aspects of cultural life has an affinity with rhythm analysis, and I think it's timely to take stock of what they offer in terms of renewing our attention to cultural historical research. So perhaps you'll see today that I'm throwing more kind of questions rather than trying to sort of conclude, trying to answer them all. But I think this is an interesting topic for me to discuss today. So I think there are two parts to my talk. First of all, I'm going to talk about my conception of rhythm, how I sort of look at rhythm as an idea, as a phenomena, as a kind of methodological orientation. And the second part, I will be looking at some kind of tentative suggestions about how one could proceed to overcome the question of, but you were not there. So first of all, I think the way in which I define rhythm is that I see rhythm as a meta-sense. So the kind of focus is on the kind of sensorium of cultural historical life. And by talking about senses, I don't mean the kind of conventional narrative of how we talk about five senses, the sensory, the kind of subject, so gleaning information from the world. So you have the the description of how I see, how I sort of hear, how I touch. But I think I'm very much sort of taking on board sort of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological understanding of rhythm, which is the kind of intertwining of the subject and the object. So how one is caught up in the material world, how one is kind of reckoning with the world through the meta sense of rhythm. So this kind of synthesis, kind of Gestalt sense of all the different kind of sensual registers of how one is kind of inhabiting the material world. So how one insert oneself in the material world, and also the focus, I think, on rhythm is also on the idea of materiality, of the material world itself. What are the kind of affordances of different stuff that we live with? So that's kind of, I think, that's not to be overlooked in our kind of research in rhythm analysis. The kind of, how rhythm and feelings, they're kind of furnished by a constellation of things, by the patterning of social entities from which the human subject, the human body is a part of. So I think this might be like a abstract sort of, interpretation of rhythm. And I just want to bring up a passage from which I read in a book written by Peter Handke, so a writer of fiction, and the name of the book is called Short Letter, Long Farewell. So basically, it's a bit like a travelogue. The protagonist kind of wanders across the landscape of America. And this one is particularly talking about the experience of wandering the street of New York. So I just want to read this passage to you to kind of in a way to touch upon what I've just said in a kind of in a concrete passage. As I sat motionless, something began to move back and forth in my head in a rhythm resembling that of my wanderings about New York that day. Once it stopped, then for a while it ran straight ahead. Then it zigzagged, then it circled a while and subsided. It was neither an image nor a sound, only a rhythm that now and then pretended to be one or the other. It was only then that I saw inside me the city that up until then I had almost overlooked. So I think this passage for me kind of captures beautifully what I mean by rhythm as a meta sense. So there's not really a kind of description of what the protagonist saw or heard. It's really a kind of synthesis of all the kind of sensory registers of the city. So how the kind of the landscape, the kind of streets of New York, kind of sear the bodily consciousness. So I think it's quite important to think about rhythm as a kind of bodily consciousness, or a kind of medium through which a city becomes intelligible, through which a place becomes intelligible. And also, I think it's quite interesting that. How it's sort of written here, the city inside me. There's this kind of sense of how rhythm is a kind of sense that's kind of ingested by the body. And I wonder if the recognition of a place, such as the streets of New York, has a kind of diachronic character. The sentences where it says kind of rhythms emerged, subsided a while, and kind of encircling and so on. So the kind of idea of rhythm as a meta sense that's inherently historical, that's inherently sort of temporal, so kind of sliding on this kind of scale of past and present, having sort of multiple referential points, if you like. So it's never a sense of one particular moment. It's always in a constellation of different sort of modes of sensing. And also, I think Lefebvre reminds us that that rhythm preserves both the measure that initiates the process and the recommencement of this process, with modifications, therefore, with multiplicity and plurality. And I think I treat this sentence less as a kind of definition of rhythm per se, but rather as a particular kind of attention to the kind of phenomena of rhythms. So how there's a kind of recurring, how there's a kind of topological relationship of different moments in history. And perhaps it kind of invites us to create a richer vocabulary to describe historical life than the past, present, and the future. So I think in my work, in terms of looking at the conjunctural shift of Britain in the 1970s and 80s, how if I focus on the kind of the sensory, the kind of mode of sensing this particular shift, how one could say a historical change happens at the level of rhythms, how it kind of happens at the levels in which we reckon with the world. So I think it kind of creates a more complex sort of issue around how particular modes of sensing are more obdurate, are more kind of stubborn, if you like. How that creates a different different ways of periodizing history. So you could have the long time span where you could explore the kind of how kind of modes of engagement with the world kind of stays put, and the kind of the many sort of processes in which modes of sensing are shifting. So I think what I'm really getting here is that in terms of looking at history and doing historical work through rhythm analysis, we're not really looking at reconstructing the past or representing the past. I think this is kind of where largely this anxiety comes from, the fact that you were not there. So if one thinks about looking at history as a animation, so we're trying to animate history through the lens of rhythm, through the ways in which one connects with each other on that level of rhythm. So that's a kind of whole different sort of mode, whole different kind of orientation towards historical work, and through which rhythm analysis has a lot to offer. I think I'll move on to the notion of historical imagination in terms of doing rhythm analysis for historical work. So the notion of historical imagination, I think, is in direct sort of contrast to a kind of empiricist investigation of what happened. This kind of representing historical facts, representing historical events. So historical imagination is a term that comes from the French writer Jean Cartier, where he sort of proposed a kind of poetic knowledge, which I think rhythm analysis has a lot of relationship with. So in terms of historical imagination, there's a kind of particular temperament, particular kind of disposition in pursuing historical work, historical knowledge. So I think for the sort of second half of my talk, I'm going to talk about what are the kind of historical data which are conducive to the kind of unraveling of the phenomenal form of history, rather than history as something that's kind of boxed away that needs to be reconstructed. So I think as a historian, there's a kind of the inevitable sort of practice of selecting, arranging, and assigning significance to sort of data, to historical materials. So I want to look at what are the kind of potential avenues, what are the potential data we can recruit in kind of writing about the phenomenal form of history. So to treat kind of rhythm itself as a historical event, kind of the rhythmic event is the object of a historical study. So I think what I have been talking about how there's kind of insistent sort of material focus in terms of looking at rhythm as a kind of mode of sensing. So materiality is incredibly important, I think, to one's study of historical work through rhythm. So if we look at sort of rhythm as a kind of bodily consciousness, as a ways of sort of inhabiting the material world, I think then the kind of emphasis, the kind of focus or direction of cultural historical work should really be sort of lodged in a kind of materialist history. So I'm thinking particularly about design history, so which is a kind of very young discipline in itself. So I'm not really thinking about design history as kind of studying the kind of aesthetic masterpieces, the kind of iconic design of the 20th century, but the kind of looking at sort of mundane things, the kind of object that we live with, and to what extent that they play an agency in the ways in which we sort of relate to the world, in which we sort of inhabit a particular rhythm in which certain social relationships are made intelligible. So the kind of the focus or the accent is really placed on studying sort of things and the kind of constellation of things, and mapping out how those constellation of things configure a particular kind of rhythm. I think secondly, this is kind of related to my current project, which I'm looking at the kind of alternative mode of visual analysis. So in taking sort of cultural texts for doing historical work, and which kind of historians are probably very much familiar with in terms of reading films or photographs or novels against social ideas. So people kind of normally say, well, this text is here because it kind of interprets the kind of the feminist idea of so and so. So this kind of conception of cultural texts, of how one decodes cultural texts, I think is very much kind of needs to be re-examined through a kind of a phenomenological idea of how they are cultural realities on their own terms, how the kind of plasticity, the kind of the formal manifestation of a particular painting, a kind of sculpture. There is a kind of rhythm and tonalities and sort of aesthetic register that kind of allows it to kind of build a cultural continuum. So with the rest of the kind of cultural phenomena, that they are on par with these things rather than sort of being derivative of social reality. So I'm kind of exploring this kind of alternative ways of contextualizing these cultural texts, not seeing them as something that kind of allows one to read social ideas into them, but rather that there is a kind of potential capacity for them to illuminate the kind of the affective, the kind of rhythmic sort of experience of social life. So I think there's quite a lot of potential in exploring cultural history through cultural texts, but not through a kind of representational mode of analysis. And lastly, I think I want to talk about how there's a kind of material weight to descriptions. So, the idea of you were not there, but what can you use to produce cultural historical work? So the idea of sort of how, as a rhythm analyst doing cultural historical work, one could sort of gravitate towards sort of dense descriptions, the kind of descriptions of historical life, which really allows one to sort of disentangle the kind of rhythmic relationships between different kind of social sites. That one kind of that allows one to kind of sidestep from those kind of discursive events of history. So in terms of recounting what happened in terms of the political events, the kind of social events, the kind of compartmentalized sort of approach to historical work. But what are the kind of descriptions from oral history, from archival research that allows one to sort of perform this historical imagination that I was talking about, to construct history? I think that's quite a provocative term in the sense that history is not to be people say history is not to be fabricated and constructed, but I think there is a kind of rhetoric device in doing history, in writing history. So I'm particularly thinking about the historians, Hayden White, the historian who writes about the discourses, the kind of literary trope of writing history. So what are the kind of descriptions and sort of literary forms of sort of data which we can use to unpick the kind of the opaqueness of a historical life? I think that's really, really interesting as a kind of as approach, as a kind of direction that one can take to perform a kind of rhythm analytical way of doing history. I think this is all I want to say for now. Is there any questions?
Well, thank you very much.